Can you recognize that perfection is only an illusion and that chasing perfection only leads to opportunities to criticize and judge yourself? I am the first to admit that I am a recovering perfectionist. It's a long, slow, and painful process, but I am recovering. I say I'm recovering because I do recognize that perfection is a total illusion. And yes, for decades, the pursuit of this unattainable goal led me to nothing but self-criticism and self-judgment. But even though I'm a zillion times better than I was in the past, like so many things, I am still a work in progress. I got my hair done a couple of days ago, and she has been doing it just a smidge different. I'm not sure anyone beyond the two of us would even notice, but you'll need to trust me, it's different. It's all in the process. I try to remember to take a few pictures each time so I can pull them out next time when we're talking about what to do different that day. I took a few selfies just to have, and of course, like always, I was ridiculously critical. Mind you, literally no one beyond maybe my hairstylist who sees me come in at my worst will ever even see these. And yet here I am searching for flaws. I can see the vein in my forehead. There's a wrinkle over there. My smile looks crooked. My neck, I think it looks old. I think my one eyelid looks slightly droopier than the other one. My eyebrows need waxed. I should probably wear makeup. No lie. Every single one of those thoughts went through my head. I deleted a few and left one for reference purposes only. The next day, maybe it was yesterday, I don't know. I was looking at my camera roll and I caught a glimpse of a picture. And my first thought was, wow, that's a really good picture. And then I realized it was the same exact picture that I had spent the day before dissecting and criticizing. With a fresh perspective and zero preconceptions, I just glanced at it, and my first thought was that it was gorgeous. Everything about the picture was the same. The only thing that was different were the fresh eyes that weren't looking for faults. I have been known to look for perfection from myself in every area. In my roles as a mother, as a wife, daughter, sister, aunt, friend, you name it. In my job, whether it's in my regular job as a professor or here as a podcaster. I want my home to be perfect, and it never is. I want the meals I cook to be perfect, and they absolutely never are. I want the vacations I plan to be perfect, my workouts to be perfect, the way I answer questions to be perfect. The way that I respond to emails or texts or post pictures or literally everything I do. I have expected perfection from myself. And you know what? Literally every time I failed to attain it because surprise, surprise, it is impossible to attain perfection because it does not exist. The only thing I've managed to accomplish at these times is getting really good at picking myself apart. So I'm recovering. I'm learning to let go of this ridiculous illusion and stop expecting to reach an unattainable standard. It's an illusion that I am happy to let go of. Maybe not every day and in every situation just yet, but I'm working on it. I'm a work in progress. So, can you too recognize that perfection is only an illusion and that chasing perfection only leads to opportunities to criticize and judge yourself? Hey guys, it's Jen. I saw a tweet not long ago that said, "Are you happy or are you a firstborn and also a girl?" Which is sadly much too funny to me because to so many of us firstborn daughters, we feel that in our souls. In the siblings episode, I mentioned that the number of siblings you have in your family of origin and the relationship among you can greatly impact your future self and future life. And so can the place you fall within your siblings. Well, read that. Today, we're going to have a conversation about birth order. Birth order theory is fun In fact, when I first started teaching Family Comm, I didn't have it included in the course. It was only when I mentioned it to them in passing that I realized how interested they were in it. So I added it in. And then not only have I included it every time I've taught the class, but it is honestly probably everyone's favorite topic. It's their favorite because so many people look at it and are like, wow, how do you know that about me and about my family? Yes, you have your outliers, people who are like, nah, that's not accurate. Absolutely. Of course you do with everything. That's, of course, the beauty and the curse of social scientific research. But for so many of us, it's incredibly on target. Birth order theory is heavily supported by psychologists as a way that the order in which a child is born impacts their personality. Remember way back in the Beneath the Layers episode when we talked about parenting styles and approaches to studying family communication? Of course, we talked a lot about looking at family from a comm perspective, but we also talked about both the psychological and the sociological perspectives as well. Looking at our family from the communication perspective focuses on the process of creating and sharing meaning as our family members interact with each other, not the impact of family on individual personalities or individual personalities on family, because that's more the psychological perspective, and not the relationship between family characteristics and the larger society, because that's more the sociological perspective. All right. Birth order theory is a perfect example of the intersection among the three perspectives, because really it looks at the personality traits that you're born with, the situation you're born into, and then how kind of the combination of the two impacts your communication and your interactions. So the concept of birth order theory was introduced in 1918 by a researcher named Alfred Adler. Now, you may be thinking, why do I know that name? Well, I'll tell you why. In that same Beneath the Layers episode, we talked about positive parenting as a parenting style. Do you remember who introduced that style of parenting? None other than Alfred Adler. Interesting overlap, right? Adler was a medical doctor who began working then with Sigmund Freud. But unlike Freud, he believed in taking a holistic view of the person to truly understand how we become who we are. So he thought that it was just as important to include the social and the community aspects of a person's life, so the sociological perspective, as it was to include the internal thoughts and emotions, so the psychological perspective. Adler wanted to understand just how our social interactions and other social factors might influence someone's personality. Specifically, he became interested in how the effect of birth order impacted children, how it impacted their thoughts, their behaviors, probably because of his interest in parenting. As much as we might like to think that everything is even Steven in our families, the reality is the situation is never the same for two children in the same family. So each child will show results of their attempts to adapt to their own circumstances. Yes, we absolutely are born with personality traits. Birth order just defines how we handle our inherited traits. So it's not like we are born with a niche. It's more looking at how our family environment and the dynamics can shape our individual personality during those formative years. And yes, how we have shaped our children's personality by providing them with a particular family environment and our individual family dynamic. All families are different, of course, but there are definitely similarities in the interactions between parents and children and siblings. So our personalities are shaped by a number of different influences, and birth order is just one of them. To establish exactly where I'm coming from here, when I say personality, I mean the actual denotative meaning of personality, not the more connotative use like, oh, she has a great personality, or his personality is totally laid back. I mean, by definition, personality refers to the lasting characteristics and behaviors that make up a person's individual adjustment to life And that includes things like major traits, things such as sociability, motivation, assertiveness, interests, values, self-concepts, abilities, emotional patterns. So very many factors influence our personalities and how they are developed. Most commonly, though, they're grouped into 6 different categories of influence. So we're going to go through the 6 of them. First, we tend to think of the biological influences on our personality because we inherit so many traits and features from our parents. Just like the color of our eyes or the sound of our voice, the personality traits that we inherit, they are oftentimes genetic. But we can't stop there. The second factor, social influences, because every time we interact with others in our various social circles, we learn behaviors and thought patterns. Think about how much being in a school environment impacts your kids beyond the textbook education. The behaviors or the thought patterns that a child picks up in a public school versus a private school versus a Catholic school versus being homeschooled. Yes, you may have your preferences about one environment being better or worse, but it's not a matter even of being good or bad. It's just different. We all saw some of this with the COVID online school year, right? Being in a home environment, despite the same teacher and the same classmates and the same schoolwork, all of it was different. And those differences that year impacted our kids, just like all interactions in their various social circles impacts their personalities, even their friends, sports teams, they all help to shape our kids' personalities. So next, all right, third, our culture, the cultural influences on our personality. A child growing up within a culture adopts traits that are consistent with the culture's beliefs, attitudes, ideas, and norms. This can refer to nationality, race, ethnicity. Interracial and intercultural families can especially see the impacts of culture, or you can see the impacts of culture on our first-gen children or in transplanted families. Next, the fourth, another impact on personality is our physical environment. I mean, I see this one in my own family. My kids are the same age as their New York City raised cousins, and there are huge differences between them and my sleepy little beach town raised kids. And I jokingly categorize my family as being intercultural because I grew up in the suburbs of a big city and my husband was a rural kid. And it's amazing the differences just in those two situations. And we grew up 3 hours away from each other. Now, a big multifaceted influence on personality is the particular situations that children face. So the sixth one is the situational influences. Depending on the situations, kids may adapt or change aspects of their personalities in response. It could be as simple as meeting someone new or losing a friendship or starting a new school, or as complex as experiencing a trauma. If a child welcomes a new sibling, that will definitely cause kids to adapt their personality in response. So we can expand this out to look specifically at the impact of birth order as one of the contributing factors in the development of our personalities. While nothing about birth order is an absolute, because of course we're people, we're all individuals and individual situations. So you may hear some of this and think, oh, that's nonsense. That's nonsense. Why did I say nonsense? I don't think I ever use the word nonsense in real life. Let's go with, oh, that's silly. Keep in mind, birth order is only one facet that has impacted your child's development. And it can be super helpful in helping you to become a better parent to each child or understanding why your child is the way that they are. And just because there are other factors involved, there is a lot of both research and anecdotal support of these patterns. That's why it's always been a favorite for my students. While there may be one or two who are like, nah, that's not us. Most of them are startled at how well it describes their families. And I know I feel so heard by the oldest descriptions, and my 3 children, they fit them pretty much to a T. So, birth order theory includes discussions about firstborns, secondborns, middles, which does get a smidge confusing if you have multiple children. There's an overlap between seconds and middles because middles really fit all of the middle ones. And then it looks at babies or youngest. And again, if you only have 2, you may see some overlap there, say between second and youngest. And then there's onlys. Onlys are interesting because there is so much overlap between firsts and onlys. Oh, and if you have a big age gap, it puts them in groups and starts all over. So to explain that, my husband and his sister, they're like 8 years apart, I think it is. So both of them have characteristics of firstborns because essentially they were both the firsts because of that big age gap, if that makes sense. However, he is more like an only though, because he really was an only in those formative years. But his sister, despite being technically a second, she is the first because she is in that second grouping with his other sister, who absolutely takes the role of the youngest. So say had there been a 4th child near to my husband's age, his personality would have been more first or second, depending on where the 4th child was. Researchers typically label a big age gap as 5 years or more. Okay, so let's start with onlys. Only because that's how I did that. Only because my literal OG listener, who I mentioned in the latest Just For Me as my friend, who was the very first person I told about the podcast, well, she has an only, and I will be super excited to see what she thinks about this description. So onlys tend to get much more attention from adults than children with siblings do because, they're the only child in most situations. So many of their early interactions involve adults rather than other children, which makes them tend to feel like they're actually little adults rather than children. Because of this, they can seem more mature than other kids their age. And in fact, they often even feel like they get along better and have an easier time interacting with adults than with their peers. They're often very confident. They are literal only children. So they're used to being the center of their parents' attention, which would obviously cause them to be self-centered and enjoy being the center of attention. It's what they know, right? They're used to getting their own way, and they often don't handle it well when they don't. They give you that, it's not fair. Well, kids with siblings are used to not getting their way, right? They're also not used to needing to compromise with anyone, and they're not used to ever having any conflict. So they often tend to be non-cooperative and very uncomfortable when they're faced with conflict. Siblings fight. We talked about this in the siblings episode, but then they make up. They fight again, and then they make up. Conflict management is a fact of life when you have siblings, but onlys, they don't have that growing up, so they aren't used to it. Conflict feels like the end of the world to them, so they are very uncomfortable with it, and they tend to try to avoid it as much as possible. Because of all the focus on them, onlys are especially encouraged to be successful, to succeed. They are conscientious, hardworking, reliable, dependable, perfectionists. So, only moms, do you recognize anyone? Okay, firstborns. Personally, I will say it is not easy being a firstborn, but we do tend to be more successful. So there is that, I guess. Anyway, while I don't like to assume much about y'all, I think it's safe to assume that we all have a firstborn. even if your first was also your last. Like I said, first and onlys have a lot of overlap. Why is that? Well, firstborns are onlys, at least for a duration of time, right? Firstborns are the newest member of the family. Everyone has super high expectations for them. New parents often feel that their extended family and the outside world are sitting there watching what their first child does to determine what they are like as a family and what they are like as parents. This is the first product of us. Look at what we made. What that means for the child is that the dominant message that the firstborns receive is that they are on display. Make us proud. With them, the family focus is outward, and they feel as though they are always on stage, being watched constantly and being judged for their actions. So, like I said, we tend to be more successful. And like onlys, we are high achievers. We're reliable, responsible, scholarly, organized. When the second is born, many first have difficulty adapting and may feel unloved or neglected because all of a sudden there's a scarcity of resources and we need to use our behavior, good or bad, to get our parents' attention now, which is why so many of us become people pleasers. But now we're the big sister. And many of us even got this shirt to prove it, right? I know I had my I'm the big sister t-shirt, which means we're in charge. We're the leader of this little growing trope of small people. So is it that we're natural born leaders or that we spend our entire lives leading other people around? The majority of former US presidents have been firstborns or at least firstborn sons. But that also means we have a tendency to be bossy and to think we're superior to other children because, well, we're clearly superior to those small children living in our house, right? We tend to be controlling and very concerned about being right. Okay, so now I'm starting to feel attacked. Oh, but one more thing, lest I forget the best part. Firstborns have a higher IQ than any others. We tend to have a 3-point higher IQ than seconds, and seconds have a 1-point higher IQ than thirds. Interesting, right? Why do you think that is? Well, they say it's because we tend to become more intelligent when we teach something to someone else. And firsts are often either formally or informally in charge of teaching their younger siblings. So, do y'all see any of your firstborns in here? Secondborn and middles start off from the very beginning with their parents' attention on the first. I mean, really, all you do is lie there or cry. And look at them. They're doing all sorts of cool things like walking and talking and running and playing and climbing, getting into everything while you just lie there or cry. So seconds and middles get used to getting lost in the shuffle, which also means they often feel a need to be unique and do anything to get attention of their own. Sometimes this will make them more rebellious. They do tend to develop abilities that the first child doesn't have in order to gain attention of their own. So very often, especially if they're close in age, firsts and seconds will be very opposite of each other. And because they have a sibling as a role model, they try to catch up with the older kids and they tend to be more competitive. Now, if they are a middle two, the seconds who are middles often are peacemakers. Remember those onlys who were afraid of conflict? Well, second children who are also middles are their total opposite because they are expert peacekeepers who specialize in conflict management. These middles, so either the seconds who are also middles or actual middle children in larger families do oftentimes get lost in the shuffle, especially in larger families. Now, middles of 3 don't typically experience the infamous middle child syndrome, like middles in larger families or with bigger age gaps do. This happens because they may become more frustrated or resentful because not only did they lose their youngest child status, but they're also constantly competing for attention with both older and younger siblings. And so they may become outgoing and rambunctious in order to get that attention. In larger families, middles don't tend to be nearly as competitive as those middles who are seconds, like we talked about, mainly because they've realized that their parents' attention is just spread too thin to even bother to try. But they become experts in cooperation, they're adaptable, and even tempered. They do feel like life is unfair because while they don't get the rights of the oldest sibling, they also don't get the privileges of the youngest, who, yes, that youngest, they get a lot of privileges. Although I'm sure my daughter would beg to differ. You can't see me, but I'm rolling my eyes at that. So anyway, the youngest or baby of the family tends to get more attention from parents because the older one or ones are becoming more independent. I know my daughter and I spend a lot of time together, just her and I, because the boys are now off kind of doing their own things a lot. Youngest have the advice and footsteps of the older siblings to walk through. And so they get that advice and kind of learning the ropes. They may not see it that way though, and instead they may feel inferior, like everyone else is bigger and more capable and more independent than they are. Because of that, they often expect others to be the ones to make decisions for them and to take responsibility. They may even become quick to blame others for everything. I know when mine were little, Ever used to blame Kane for everything. I'm pretty sure I told you about when she wrote in chalk, a sidewalk chalk on the front porch, and she wrote ASS in big letters and signed it, Love Kane. Or I'd hear something happen in the other room and yell, and she would yell, it's Kane. And poor Kane, he'd yell from somewhere else, I'm not even in there. All right, so youngest are very advanced and quicker in development and are highly motivated to outdo their older siblings in accomplishments. They are definitely the originators of anything you can do, I can do better. They are very charming and outgoing, which can sometimes make them manipulative. To me, as a firstborn people pleaser, I think the very coolest part about youngest is how secure they are in who they are because they have no boundary issues. So what do y'all think? Do you see this in your youngest too? I think that that's why so many people are even drawn to even just the anecdotal birth order research, because for a lot of us, we see these characteristics in ourselves, in our families of origin, or in our children, or maybe even in both. Of course, it's not going to be everything for everyone because we can't forget that these situational factors are only one part of our experience. We also have the biological and social, cultural, physical environments, all that impacting our development. But it does play enough of a role in our personality development that here we are 100+ years after Adler's original research, and we're still talking about it. So there must be something to it, right? Not only does understanding this help us to really see our children for who they are and maybe understand why they're the way they are, but it can also give us some insight into their interpersonal interactions too. There's a theory called similarity attraction theory. And similarity attraction theory basically says that we like people who are like us. We are drawn to people who are similar to us, whether it's appearance or background, interests, anything really. The psychology behind it is that we like to reduce our uncertainty in our situations, and we know how we'll behave or how we'll react in situations. And so people who are like us, they make us feel more comfortable because if we know how we behave and they're similar to us, we can better predict how they'll behave, which makes us more comfortable. Well, it does show up here too, because in interpersonal relationships, Firstborns are drawn to firsts, middles to middles, youngest to youngest. Funnily enough, my middle is super sociable, always has lots of friends. He gets along well with people in general. He has one friend, I think, who's an only, and literally like every other friend he's ever had has been a second like him. Parents will often feel especially connected with the child who is their same birth order because they can relate best to their situation. I know I will often tell my oldest, who even more than birth order, he's so much like me. It's like, I'm so sorry. I know how hard it is to be me, so I know how hard it is to be him. Overall, in their relationships, onlys take their perfectionism into their interpersonal relationships, which results in them having incredibly high expectations for everyone else in their life. For our firstborns, those positive, motivated characteristics that help them to be so successful academically and professionally, they also are the same characteristics that often damage close relationships that they have with others. Now, middles, they are the peacemakers. So led by those peacemaking and compromise skills, middles are most motivated to make their interpersonal relationships work. Youngest, regardless of if there are two or a whole trope of children, they have the tendency to just do things without thinking about how the consequences of their actions may affect their interpersonal relationships. So does anyone else feel very seen today? For better or worse, it's kind of like, wow, so that's why I am the way I am. Huh. And I can look at my kids and be like, yeah, I see it. Yep. So for all of my fellow firstborn perfectionists out there, see, it's not our fault. Only it's you too. So maybe we weren't born this way, expecting ourselves to be absolutely perfect at all times. Maybe it came from our situation. Well, how about we decide today that our current situation does not expect us to be perfect, because the current us recognizes that perfection is just an illusion that only leads us to opportunities to criticize and judge ourselves. Together, we can be the most perfect recovering perfectionists that ever were. Thank you so much for listening. I know that you could have spent this time today with anyone, and I'm so very grateful for you choosing me. I hope that you have taken something from this today that gives you a better understanding of your family and maybe even yourself. If you're not already, please follow the show so you don't miss new content. Also, I'd love to have you reach out to me on socials. I'm on Facebook, follow Reframing Me, and join the Facebook group Reframing Me, a podcast community, to connect with other women who are also raising teens and trying to rediscover themselves. On Instagram and TikTok, I'm at Reframing Me, or email me with questions or issues you might want me to cover in a later episode, jen@reframing-me.com. I hope you enjoy the podcast enough to go in and review it, and please consider sharing it with someone else who you think might enjoy or benefit from it. That's how we will build this community of listeners. And if you're new to the community, welcome. Be sure to go back and catch up on earlier episodes. Until next time, be well, communicate, and be imperfectly you.